declining fertility is giving rise to families with children of one sex, like only sons or only daughters. How is such a demographic transition going to impact the patriarchal societies of Asia? We really look forward to this interesting topic, Dr. Kira. Over to you.
Thank you so much.
For the first 45 minutes, we'll listen to you, and then, we would like to have some time for results.
Great.
That is okay.
I'll share my screen. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. Pakistan is obviously a very relevant context for the topic of the talk, so it's exciting to have your feedback and questions. I'll be presenting 2 papers that are already published, but I'm still working in this area, and I really look forward to your questions and feedback. So first, of course, the background on this is the demographic transition, and more recently, the decline in fertility that's been really substantial. Most of Asia is down to a replacement or even lower level of fertility around the contemporary period, and much of the rest of the world has also gone down as well. Sub-Saharan Africa is really the only region with still relatively high fertility. So one part of that decline in fertility is what Gilmodo has dubbed the fertility squeeze. That when you have a large number of children, say 5 or 6, you're nearly guaranteed to have a son and also a daughter as well, to have both genders of children in your family. But as you have fewer and fewer children, maybe just 2, maybe even just 1, the chances that you would have just children of one sex, either only sons or only daughters, increases. And that's just a matter of the probability, the roll of the die, about half the time you have a son, half the daughter, roughly speaking, if you do nothing to change the sex composition of your children. So when you're in a low fertility context, if you want to have a son, you want to have a daughter, or you want to have both, you have some preferences about the sex composition of your children, you either have to do something to make that happen in many cases, or you have to be satisfied with a less than optimal situation in many cases. So the reason this is so pressing in context with patrilineal family systems is that probably nowhere in the world are sons and daughters interchangeable and thought of as the same in terms of their roles and responsibilities, but the differences are particularly stark in patrilineal family systems, right? So sons, of course, continue on the family line. The male line is the family in many ways. It's normative and often practiced and practice as well that sons reside with their natal family their entire lives. And even if they're not in practice, they're seen normatively as being primarily a member of that family wherever they reside their entire lives. They also present wealth inflows, that their earnings flow to the family. Also, they inherit from the family and use those to support the family more broadly. And they're expected to provide old age support for their parents. Daughters, of course, present the inverse in many ways. They are seen as only temporary members of their natal family. They join their husband's family upon marriage. They're expected to reside with that family, and they present wealth outflows for their natal family, right? There might be dowry, but even if not a dowry, if a daughter is earning, her earnings will go to her husband's family. They would only temporarily accrue to her natal family while she was unmarried. And also she's expected to provide old age support for her in-laws, not for her own family. So in such a context, of course, sons are really vital for the continuation of a particular family. So there's been a lot of discussion about what this means and what might be the shorter term horizon, starting in the 80s, but really in the early 90s. That as fertility declines and you have this squeeze, that families, they have to make sure that they have that son, right? So they might just use selective stopping behavior and that they continue to have births until they have a son. But this strategy results in extra unwanted daughters, which are often neglected or mistreated, or at least not treated as well as those desired sons. And then increasingly, as sex-selective abortion, ultrasound, and abortion became available more in the 80s and more so in the 90s, you can also avoid daughters entirely through sex-selective abortion. Right, and there's been a lot of work showing how this can skew sex ratios, even sex ratios at birth with sex-selective abortion, and confers many harms on women and girls. But I want to turn this on its head, and I speculate the exact same thing, this fertility decline and fertility squeeze, may in the longer term have a very different effect that will outweigh these short-term effects, or at least balance out, if not outweigh, in the long term, and perhaps even erode patrilineal family systems. So as fertility declines, sonless families, that is families that have only daughters, are going to increase. Certainly many families, as we know, and I just discussed, will practice sex-selective abortion and selective stopping to ensure the sons, but many families won't. They'll try, but they'll fail. They'll be unwilling to try, right? Or they're not able to try. They're not able to engage in these behaviors. Perhaps they're too old to have additional children, or if you can for other reasons, or sex-selective abortion is not available. So you're going to have a rise in sonless families, daughters-only families, and they'll be unable to maintain customary patrilineal practices, right? You can't depend on a son for old age support, have only a son inherit if you don't have any sons. Now, the customary way to do this is to bring in an extra son, a nephew, or some other extra son in your natal family, but that supply of extra sons, if you will also be eroded with fertility decline. So what might families do? One obvious adaptation is to generally treat your daughter like a son, to expect her to provide old age and support and take on other roles of the son, or to turn outside the family entirely, right? You depend on a pension or some other source for old age support and things like that. Okay, so both of these adaptations, if you had some critical mass of daughters-only families engaging in them, likely reluctantly, they would prefer not to, but they do end up having to adapt in some way, then might create normative change and might also lead to the rise of institutions that support such changes, like old age homes or more pension systems, things like that, and that this would allow these changes to also spread to families with sons, making sons and daughters more similar and having a more bilateral family system rather than patrilineal, and would also be beneficial for women and girls. So this is the theorized pathways. Okay, so, and I call this a potential another gender dividend with the demographic transition and fertility decline, that this rise of sonless families would be a potential gender dividend. So I'll present results from two papers. One is just a descriptive, essentially saying, did the first trend happen? Did sonless families increase as fertility declined in patrilineal context? It's possible that selective stopping and sex-selective abortion was so widespread that these families did not actually rise. And then also the causal question, do we see signs of transformative behaviors in these sonless families? So first I'll present the work from the descriptive paper looking at trends over time. So I look specifically at the rise of sonless families, but also daughters only and sons only family in Asia, and then also added North Africa because it's similar in terms of patrilineal family system, and the MENA region includes West Asia and North Africa. I'll also note that this paper was done with my wonderful co-author, Roshan Pandian, who produced the beautiful graphs that you'll be seeing in a couple minutes. So we use data from 90 different surveys and censuses. This is primarily the demographic and health surveys for the vast majority of these countries. But since the DHS does not cover East Asia, we also had to add some other data sources. So it goes roughly from about 1990 to about 2015. It depends on the country, the exact dates, and we have 20 different countries. So our analytical sample is the number, is mothers aged 40 to 49. So there's a little bit of a slippage here. We're interested in families and we're looking at mothers 40 to 49, right? So there might be other women of childbearing age if you have a case of multiple wives or sisters-in-law living together in the same family. To the extent we're able to assess this for these countries, it looks like there's minimal slippage there, but that's something to keep in mind, that some of these families could have a son from another wife or another sister-in-law. So we'll look at the number and sex of the children of these mothers aged 40 to 49, and these children could reside anywhere. They may reside with the mother, they may not, but they are all alive when the mother's in her 40s and basically done with childbearing. So simply we look at the mean number of children, right, the fertility basically, proportion sons only and proportion daughters only over time for these 20 countries. We also break down China and India by states and provinces. I should also note, given the audience, that we did the same for Pakistan, but it didn't make the final paper because Pakistan was remarkably similar across the subnational units. So we didn't end up including it in the final version. So these are the 20 countries, and you can see it hits pretty much all the subregions of Asia and North Africa. This represents 87% of the population of the region and 54% of the global population. So certainly not the whole region, but pretty close. So this is the time of the first wave and then the last wave. So as I said, about 1990 to 2015, but it's important to note that there's some exceptions here. So Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Tajikistan, we just have 5 or 4 years of data. Kazakhstan even ends in 1999. And then notably China, we have 40 years starting in 1975. So China, we're able to do a little longer time trend. This is the mean number of children for the mothers aged 40 to 49 in the first and last wave for these countries. So these countries are ordered by the mean number of children at the last wave. You might have been wondering, what's the order here? So of course, East Asia had the lowest fertility. That's why they're all at the top. And then Pakistan, second from the bottom at 4.9, and Yemen at 6.4. And you might be thinking those numbers are too high for current or, roughly 2015 fertility. And remember, that's because this is the mean number of women in their 40s. So generally, this is fertility that happened, roughly 20 years ago or so. So of these 20 countries, and all but 2 had substantial declines in the fertility. Generally, the mean number of children went down by 1 or 2. China went down by 3, notably. And then the 2 countries that didn't have statistically significant declines in fertility were Japan and Yemen. Japan's fertility decline was too early. They were down at a replacement level of about 2.1 in 1957, and Yemen's is too recent. So they started declining really in the late 90s. So for the other 18 countries, we do expect a rise in daughters only and sons only families. Okay, I'm going to start by giving you just an overview of the 20 countries as a whole, and then I'll zoom in on a few countries that sort of exemplify some interesting patterns. So first, on sons only families. Here we have the countries, and then the blue dot is the last or most recent wave, and the red open dot is the first wave. So first, zooming in on those blue dots, which is how the countries are ordered, the levels range from about 6% sons only to 40% sons only, and that huge number of 40% is China, which is an outlier, right? South Korea is next, which is at 28%. And we do have, as we expected, statistically significant rises in 17 of 18 countries that had declining numbers of children. And the exception here is Kazakhstan, which is in some ways not really an exception because we only have those 4 years of data, and there's not much of a decline in Kazakhstan and change in the analytical sample there. So that's about what we would expect given the time period we have for Kazakhstan. So it's sort of a quasi exception, you might say. We also use standard demographic decompositions to parcel out how much of these changes between the first and last wave were due to the change in numbers of children versus number-specific proportion son only. So this is the change due to all other factors. would chiefly be due to differences in parents affecting the sex composition of their children. And here, I won't show you the results, but we can bring them up in the Q&A, but declining numbers did account for virtually all the rise in 12 of these countries and the majority in 5 others. So it is largely the change in numbers, the decline in fertility that's driving this. Okay, these are the results for daughters-only families. And you might notice that the blue dots are a little farther to the left, and you wouldn't be wrong. We do see lower levels, but still non-trivial proportions daughters only in some countries. The range is from 3% in Yemen up to 28% in China. So China, again, at the top, but not such an outlier in terms of daughters only families. Here, it's not universal, the rises, as with sons families. There's statistically significant rises in 13 of the 18 countries that had declining numbers. And the exceptions are these countries in red, Kazakhstan, which is, again, sort of a quasi-exception, but more importantly, Kyrgyz Republic, Egypt, Pakistan, and Nepal, which did not have statistically significant increases. And those are all due to, as we'll talk more about, suppression of sonless families. So they should have had rises or larger rises, but did not because these families were suppressed. But we still have rises in 13. And the decomposition again suggests that the declining numbers does account for the entire rise in 7 countries, the majority in 4, and about half in the other 2 countries. And those 2 are South Korea and Vietnam. We can talk more about what's going on there in the Q&A. Okay, so here is the picture of how the proportion only sons and the proportion only daughters are related to the mean number of children overall. So each dot here is a country wave or a Chinese province wave or an Indian state wave. So the Chinese provinces and the other East Asian countries are in blue. The Indian states and other South Asian countries, including Pakistan, in red, and then other regions are the green dots. So you can see that we have the expected curvilinear relationship that we would expect given that squeeze relationship we talked about in the beginning. And with sons, you have a pretty tight relationship here, right? These dots are pretty tight together. And we have a Spearman correlation of -0.95, quite high. For daughters only families, we have the similar curvilinear pattern, but it's weaker. The dots are more spread out. Spearman correlation of -0.77. So still pretty high, but not nearly as high as 0.95. Also notice that it takes a lower level of fertility or a mean number of children to hit the same levels of only sons or only for the daughters only families. So if you go, let's say, to 0.1 for the sons, we hit that at about 4.5, whereas for the daughters only, you hit that right at 3.5. And for the 0.2, it's 3 for sons. 0.2 is at just a little bit over 2 for sons, for daughters, excuse me. Part of the mismatch here, though, is that the expected numbers of daughters only families and sons only families is based on the composition. So what percentage have 1 child, 2 child, 3 child, 4 child, and not just the mean number. There's a bit of slippage between means and those compositions because you can have the same mean with different composition. So we also looked at what we're calling these counterfactual proportions, daughters only or sons only families. And this is the proportion of families you would have, only daughters or only sons, if the numbers of children were as we observed, the composition of numbers we observe, but each child's sex was independent with a probability of 0.4878 of being female. So parents are not doing anything to affect the sex composition of their children, right? If you have 2 sons, you're not any more likely to stop childbearing than those with 2 daughters. You're not using sex-selective abortion, etc. Okay, so this here's the equation, but just to put it more simply, this is just a standard standardization equation in demography, formal demographic methods, assuming that the biological probability 0.4878 for females and 0.5122 for males. Right. So with one kid, you have one roll of the dice. For two kids, you have two roll of the dice, and so on. So we compare these counterfactual proportions, what you would expect they would be if parents weren't tampering with the sex composition of their children versus what we actually see. Okay, so the observed proportions are on the Y, and then these counterfactual are on the X. And if you look at only sons, you can see a really tight scatter along this line where the two values are equal, a Pearson correlation of 0.98, right? Incredibly close to 1. For the daughters only, however, we see that a lot of the dots are below the line, showing a suppression of these daughters only family, that the observed proportions are below the counterfactual proportions, which is what we would expect. And the correlation is 0.93, which is still pretty darn high, but not nearly as high as 0.98. Notice also that when the sons only dots are off this line, they tend to be above it rather than below it, suggesting that in some places sons only families are elevated above what we would expect given the counterfactuals. Okay, now we'll go into looking at actual trends over time in a few select countries to exemplify some patterns that we see. And I want to start with Pakistan because that is, of course, the country probably of most interest to everyone in the room. So Pakistan, for these cohorts, did not have a substantial decline in fertility. It went from just under 6 to just under 5. So about, a decline of 1 child, but still at a high level at the end. So there was a small, but still statistically significant rise in sons-only families. There was a slight rise of 2.2 percentage points in the counterfactual proportion daughters only, but the actual proportion daughters only went up by a little over 1% and was not statistically significant. And the reason is that there was suppression keeping it down below that rise of 2.2 that you would have expected. So as we talked about earlier, Pakistan is one of the countries where suppression actually avoided a statistically significant rise in daughters only families. And the level is just over 5% in this cohort in 2018. And sons only families not that much higher, given the still high level of fertility. Also note that the sons only line is pretty much on that counterfactual. That shaded area is a 95% confidence interval, so it's always within that. I'm going to skip to India, Pakistan's neighbor, of course, and India looks a little different. India's had a much larger fertility decline. So in 1992, with the first wave, it was just above 4, and then 2015 is just above 3. So it had a very large rise in sons only and is at a much higher level, 22% in 2015. And notice that the sons only families are elevated above the counterfactual line. So that's in contrast to Pakistan and also Bangladesh. India also has much more suppression of the daughters only families. Okay, so it did have a statistically significant rise from about 8 to 11%, but a lot of suppression too, as you can see the counterfactual, which is the dashed line. The red line showing observed proportions is far below that, and as fertility declines, right, and people experience that squeeze more and more, the gap between the observed and the counterfactual gets larger and larger. This is also the case in Nepal and nearly every Indian state when you would break it down. So India, of course, is quite large and has a lot of heterogeneity across states. So I just wanted to show you a couple states that show a little bit different trends. So Punjab, Indian Punjab, not to be confused with Pakistan Punjab, of course, is infamous for imbalanced sex ratios at birth. And it, not surprisingly, also has the highest levels of suppression of daughters-only families. So fertility, the mean number of children for these cohorts declined from 4 to 2.5. And with that decline to a small number of children, we see a big ballooning in sons-only families from just under 15 to over 25%. But daughters-only families were suppressed to stay at a constant level of 4 to 5%. So that's the most extreme case. Several other Indian states also avoided rises due to suppression, but Punjab is the most dramatic. We see much higher levels of daughters-only families, around 20% in South India. But there's also, and that's in keeping in part with the the low fertility in Kerala compared to say Bihar or UP. But there's also an interesting thing that happens in the last wave. So this is Kerala, and you can see that the lines are pretty much matching with the counterfactual until the very last wave, when the mean number of children is right around 2. And there we see the all India pattern emerge, where daughters-only families are suppressed and sons-only families are elevated. So Kerala has gotten a lot of press as being the most gender egalitarian, the best place for women in the region. But we do see this all India pattern of suppression of daughters-only families emerge when fertility did get really low and down at that level of 2. And we see a similar, although less dramatic, pattern for Tamil Nadu. China, as we talked about, is the most dramatic rise in both the daughters-only and sons-only families. All right, we were able to start in 1975, where it was just below 5 children, and it went down to 1.6 to 1.7 in the most recent period. So we see that huge increase in sons-only families, huge increase in daughters-only families, but the daughters-only families are suppressed, and we do see that that gap increases over time as fertility went down. Sons-only families are not elevated in China, though. So we have this Indian and Nepal pattern of elevated sons only, suppressed daughters only, and the other patrilineal countries, we just have suppressed daughters only. And there's a contrast with the bilateral Southeast Asian countries, so Indonesia, Cambodia, and the Philippines. And I'm going to show you the pattern using Indonesia here. So you can see that the lines, the dashed counterfactual lines and the solid observed lines are very close to each other. There's no suppression of daughters-only families in the bilateral Southeast Asian countries. We also divided Indonesia up into patrilocal and non-patrilocal provinces to see if there would be suppression of daughters-only families in the patrilocal provinces, and we do see that. So here is the roughly 1/5 of the country that has patrilocal practices, and we do see a suppression of daughters-only families emerges and gets larger as the number of children declines to lower levels. And in the rest of the country, which is not patrilocal, the observed is even closer to the counterfactual. So we do see this consistent pattern of suppression in patrilineal context, even within Indonesia. Okay, so that's the overview of the trends. We'll just quickly, with our remaining time, I want to give you the highlights of a paper that started to look at whether families are actually adapting to having only daughters. And specifically, this is going to look at mothers' expectations of old age support and whether sonless mothers give up patrilineal expectations that a son will support them in old age. And this is going to use panel data from the India Human Development Survey. So this is a nationally representative panel of about 40,000 households, and the household heads, which were largely men, as well as ever married women 15 to 49 were interviewed in 2004-5 and 2011-12. There's also a third wave in the field right now. And this was collected by the NCAER in Delhi and the University of Maryland. So my analytical sample here is going to be a marriage cohort, roughly speaking. So I'm starting in wave 1, 2005, and I'm trying to get all the newlywed women. So the way, so this is women that are married, but they don't yet have children. So this is married but childless women aged 15 to 34. Okay, and the age cutoff there is just to keep them so that they are plausibly newly married. Okay, then we observe them again 7 years later in 2011-12 at wave 2. And now 275 of them have one child, 722 2 to 4, and 198 no children. These 198 are, infecund women for the most part. So toss out the 198 women with no children, and then a look at the change in expectations for the women with one child and 2 to 4 children. And the reason I've broken these up is there's different analytical strategies for the different samples. So I'm interested in changes and expectations of old age support. So the questions, there was 2 of them, one on residential and one on financial. Who do you expect to live with when you get old, and who do you expect will support you financially? And the response options were a son, a daughter, both a son and daughter, or other, also no one or don't know. And the patrilineal expectation is, of course, expecting a son. So I'm going to look at whether they expected a son versus any other option. So notice this could be saying daughter, both, or other, although I'll also show you results, descriptive results for all 4 categories. So the women with one child, this is the strongest identification strategy, where you can use a differences in differences approach, because in India, the first child, their sex is plausibly exogenous or random, whereas this is not true for second, third, fourth, etc. child. So the treatment here is the plausibly exogenous, or at least quasi-exogenous sex of the child. And with women 2 to 4, we're going to take a different approach, looking at change more directly. Okay, so as I noted, the sex of the first child does appear to be random in India, but the 7 years between waves here is too long because women have time to go on to have another birth. It does look like those with daughters were a little more likely to progress to a next birth than those who had a son. So we would expect 48.8% daughters, roughly speaking, and we have 44.4%, which is marginally statistically significant. The groups are balanced on their covariance. So again, I would say this is quasi-random, but not 100%. So the approach is I'm going to compare their expectations at wave 1 when they're childless. They don't yet know what the sex of the child will be, versus in wave 2 when they have one child. So they either have a son or a daughter, and then we also know at wave 1 whether they go on to have a son or a daughter. And we'll look at how their expectations changed from between wave 2 and wave 1 once they know the sex of that child. And then we'll look at the difference between those with sons and those with daughters. Okay, first I'm just going to show you the simple descriptives across those 2 groups, mothers with sons and mothers with daughters, across the 2 waves. So wave 1, those who go on to have a son but do not yet have a son at the time they answered this question, about half said they expected a son to provide an old age support. About another half said other, sort of hedging their bets, and the 9% both, and 3% said daughter. In wave 2, when they do have a son, virtually everyone, 93% said we expect a son, and 5% still saying other. Now turning to those who go on to have a daughter at wave 2. In wave 1, they are the same as those who go on to have a son, this is comforting that there's not selection bias here in the sample, that these women were the same starting out, and that the sex of the child is plausibly random. So about half did say they expected a son, and again, about half saying other, and then 8% both. In wave 2, though, when they have that daughter, then they look very different from those who had a son. About a quarter are still saying they expect a son, and about a third still saying other. But now we have a large fraction, about a third, saying they expect a daughter to provide old age support, and still about 6 saying both. So these are just simple descriptives. We haven't adjusted for any covariates. We're looking at the sample overall. We're not looking at changes within women. So just descriptively, the change for those with a daughter, the expecting to live with a son, a patrilineal expectation declines by 23 percentage points. For those who go on to have a son, it increases by 47 percentage points. And this is a treatment effect of -70, which is, of course, gigantic. Now, if we put this in a first differences model where we look at change within individual women, and then also adjust for some covariates that can change over time from wave 1 to wave 2, including whether she's working, whether she's practicing Purta Gungat, and the socioeconomic status of the household, we see practically identical treatment effect of -71. So still a huge effect. So with the women who had 2 to 4 children, the 722, the larger sample, will do a sort of a standard regression with looking more directly at change in expectations. I want to start just looking descriptively. So here, since they have 2 to 4 children, they can have mixed sex composition, both a son and a daughter, sons only or daughters only. And in wave 1, you can see that they're already looking a little bit different. And most particularly the daughters only, half of them said a son, whereas for those with sons only and those with mixed, almost 2/3 said a son. So we see already that those who are willing to, if you will, settle for having daughters only, were already having slightly less patrilineal expectations in the beginning. So this is a sign of selection, the fact that the sex composition of children is not random because they're engaging in selective child stopping, right, going on until they have a son, or using sex selective abortion. We do see for both the mixed and the sons only that they're highly similar in that virtually all of them do expect a son to provide old age support in wave 2. And then those with the daughters only look very different. Only a quarter expecting a son, 40% saying a daughter, and 30% still saying other. But part of this could be due to the selection that we saw in the beginning. I mean, it seems implausible that it's entirely due to that, but clearly selection is playing a role here somewhat. So there's no perfect identification strategy here, but what I did was restrict the sample to those who started out with patrilineal expectations. So I dropped these women who said other or both or daughter in the beginning in wave 1 when they didn't have children, and just took the women who started off with the patrilineal expecting a son in wave 1, and then looked to see whether they changed their expectation in wave 2 or whether they still said they expected a son. So for the residential support, there's the 446 women that started off expecting a son. And then I'm just going to do a simple logistic regression where the dependent variable is whether they shifted to expecting a daughter, both or other, and then controlling for a bunch of covariates. And these are all the controls, both socioeconomic status of the woman in the household, and then also some gender controls. These are the predicted probabilities that the women adjust their expectations, so move to expecting daughter, both, or other rather than son. And the red bars are without controls and the orange bars are with controls, and you can see it doesn't make much of a difference. The probability that those with daughters only change is extremely high, 3/4, roughly speaking, whereas very few of the mixed and sons only change. So some conclusions. So we did see suppression in some places, but sonless families, these daughters-only families, still rose in most patrilineal countries, 13 of 18 with the declining numbers, and reached substantial levels in East Asia. There were a few countries and several Indian states that did avoid these rises, including Pakistan. I want to point out, though, it's still a little bit early for these trends, right? So as we saw, in South Asia, in particular, the lowest levels of fertility were generally around 3, sometimes more 2, but more around the 3 mark. And the period fertility for 2020 right now is for India now below replacement level, also lower for Pakistan. So these cohorts in their 40s in 2015, right, were experiencing higher fertility levels. So in the next 10, 20, even 30 years, we're going to see a real acceleration of these trends, I would guess. We'll have to see, but that's my prediction. And we do see some signs that mothers are at least changing their expectations of old age support. And in the case of India, we did see that sonless mothers, many of whom were only temporarily sonless, did give up expectations that a son would provide old age support. Of course, that's not behavior, that's just their expectation. I also want to note that there is a growing literature on China on singleton daughters. So because given China's one-child policy and the large number of families that have only one child, there's a large number of families who have just one daughter. And there's a set of studies that look at how these families are adapting and do show similar things in terms of giving up filial piety practices, investing more in these daughters, co-residing, more financial transfers, but it's really focused just on singleton daughters and hasn't looked more broadly at the broader phenomena of daughters-only families. But I would expect it would apply more broadly. So looking to the future, I want to do more on looking at actual behavioral adaptations for this broader group of daughters-only families beyond the work on China on singleton girls. But of course, the main challenge is disentangling selection into who allows themselves to have only daughters versus causal effects. So I think there's really no perfect identification strategy, but doing the best we can. Also important to look more at behavior rather than just expectations. So do we actually see changes in old age support patterns? It's too early for India to observe these changes given how old these cohorts are. But maybe with this new wave of IHGS that's collecting data right now, we'll be able to have enough sufficient numbers. Also look at investments in daughters, whether parents are, for example, giving them higher quality educations, expecting them to take up remunerative occupations because they want them to provide old age support. Whether the daughters themselves perhaps hold less patrilineal attitudes because they are expecting to take on the roles of sons, whether that's also changing their parents' attitudes more broadly. Also, in terms of sons-only families, they too might have some adaptations. For instance, we might see poor families that have a lot of agricultural or household work to do. Perhaps they're having sons in sons-only families doing them because they don't have daughters to do that work, or having sons do more cooking because they don't have daughters to help mothers do that work. And then, of course, need to connect that to actual changes over time in terms of patrilineal family system, whether it might be eroding over time. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Please.
Dr. Khatija, may I ask a few questions, and I have 2 comments to make on this wonderful presentation given by the Kera. Yes, would you please allow me, Dr. Khatija?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kera, for your wonderful presentation. It was really interesting topic, and I went through your both of papers today. because I wanted to listen to you after they're going through what you have already done. So that was really good work. I have just a few questions, but I wouldn't say that these are questions. Actually, I was wondering that whether you got the chance to look at the son preference behavior of the families at the subnational level. Because when I was going through the NASO report, that is the National Statistical Office report of India, I found that in the India, the interstate migration is about 86%. And usually the migrants are females, they are women. And the primary reason of the migration is the marriage. But once they migrate to a new state or to a new center, intrastate means within the state. So when they migrate from the rural to the urban center of the same state, they take up the work. So do you think that it is the rise in the sonless families or the decline in the expectation of the sons for the social security in future among the families in India and especially in Kerala could be related to the intrastate migration rate? Like, can we compare the estimates of the only sons families and the proportion of only girls families with the intrastate migration rate? Because I was just wondering that there could be some connection, because those who migrate from the rural to the urban center and they take up the work, they don't have the time, to have more children. And because of that time constraint, or because of the time cost, the opportunity cost of the time, they would have inclined to have lesser children. And that could be gender neutral. That behavior could be gender neutral because they prefer to have lesser number of children for some other reasons, because of the cost of bearing up the children. So did you have the chance to connect these two things, the intrastate migration in India, which is phenomenal, which has been phenomenal during 2001 and 2011. It was about 87% people who migrate within the same state, but from the rural to the urban center. So did you get the chance? This is my first question. The second one is that you also talked about the below replacement and the above replacement and the replacement level countries. So did you compare these estimates of your study for these countries separately? The third one is that you said that in India you found—
Oh wait, I'm gonna have to stop you there because I'm not gonna be able to remember. So I'll have to. So let's go back to the first one. So
I can hold if you like, if you want to reply one by one, so I can hold my.
And then.
Oh yeah, yes, please, sure, go ahead, please.
So I don't want to stop you all together. Just want to pause. So for the rural to urban migration, yes, there is rural to urban migration, of course, as you note, in India. And this does not, I did look at differences across states, as I mentioned, but I did not compare urban versus rural. But you're absolutely right that fertility is lower in urban areas than it is in rural areas. So yeah, we would expect, I'm sure there is, although I have not looked at it, I'm sure there are more higher proportion sons only and daughters only family in urban areas than in rural areas, given the lower level of fertility in those areas. It's not really an issue, though, that women might be crossing state lines for marriage, because we're looking at the number of children they have when they're in their 40s, and their childbearing generally starts right when after they're married, after they've migrated. So it might be a woman who's of originally from Tamil Nadu, living in, say, Andhra Pradesh, but that doesn't matter. Yeah, if I understood your question correctly. Whether, I think in your subtext was also a question about whether the absence of sons because they're migrating for work might also affect women's expectations of old age support. And I would expect that is also interacting in some way. I mean, there's still the normative that even if your son goes away, part of the reason he goes away is to send money back to the family, right? And you're living in a place where he's not able to earn sufficient funds. So Kerala being a classic one, right? So they're still largely expecting old age support from those sons. But that does loosen the family ties. And where I do field work up in the Darjeeling Hills in West Bengal, there was a sense that sons are becoming a bit risky, sometimes especially when they migrate. So sons being gone due to migration could also interact with this in terms of the reliance on daughters. So that could well be another broad factor going on in terms of endangering these patrilineal ties. And now remind me of your second question. Oh, lost her.
I think we've lost her. Can you check me? Dr. Kira, what do you we'll just wait for Dr. Lubna to join again. Could I ask you whether you've had the opportunity to explore, or do you think that at some stage you will be exploring the social implications of having an increase in sonless families? For example, in the cultural context of Pakistan, when I talk about it, there are laws and there are legislations that somehow restrict cultural impact also, that restricts women participation in the labor force and, you know, other things. So the rise of sonless families can have some major consequences for a country like Pakistan. What do you think are the social implications and how can they be explored?
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of another example of institutions that might change. There might be this group of, I mean, Pakistan is not there yet, as we saw, but maybe in a few years, as fertility goes down further and these, you know, older or younger cohorts come of age, that, you know, they need their daughters to work to support them because they don't have any sons. That might create pressure on the government to change those laws. It might be more successful because they can say, like, look, we did our best. We would have loved to have a son. But we weren't so lucky. You're also promoting small, happy families. We did our duty. We had just 2 children and we ended up with 2 daughters. And now you need to allow them to work and you know, provide a legal environment where that's possible. So I could see that could help make those changes and might be a more acceptable or more effective way of making those changes than, say, more outwardly feminist, like just for the sake of equality, because we think it's an inherently good thing. The argument that, no, you need to do this so that our children can support us in old age because we unfortunately don't have sons, that might be a more effective argument.
All right, so there's an PhD scholar who wants to ask a question. Shafia?
Hi, Dr. Kira, great presentation. So I have just one question, or you can say clarification, which I want. What about the cultural and religious differences between countries in Asia in your group? How is it even important to consider those? Because the group of countries which you have taken, the culture and the religious elements are not exactly the same throughout Asia. So does it even matter for your study? Because I mean, for example, let's say the inheritance laws, they differ from culture to culture, or religion plays an important role in Pakistan as well. If we talk about inheritance, and sons get more inheritance than daughters, let's say. So does it have any impact, or is it something different from the topic which you are researching? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the main difference is the family system. As we saw, there's those huge differences between the bilateral family systems. And importantly, right, Indonesia is primarily Muslim, right, just like Pakistan, but they look starkly different, right? It's really the family systems that are driving it, not so much the religion. But we do see in places that are more culturally similar in terms of their family systems, like India and Pakistan, there are interesting differences. So it's interesting that Bangladesh and Pakistan, which are the 2 South Asian countries that are primarily Muslim, don't have elevated sons only families, whereas India, and it's pretty much across India, and Nepal do have the elevated sons only families. And there's been a lot of discussion within India about Muslims, right, have slightly higher fertility, although it's evening out, than Hindus. And one part of that discussion has been that it's more important for Muslims to have 1 daughter. So they're willing, if not even strongly incentivized to have more children, so that they have the son, which they want just as much as Hindus, but that they also want to have that daughter, whereas Hindus are, would like to have a son and a daughter. The vast majority want a son and a daughter, but that they're more willing to have just sons in order to have a small family size of, say, just 2 sons or 1 daughter, or 1 son if they just want 1, whereas they're not willing to go to a third to have a daughter, whereas there's some discussion that Muslims are more willing. But again, I want to stress that that's within a very similar family system. Indonesia looks totally different, right? Which really suggests it's really the family systems, not religion, which is a driver, but conditional and having basically the same family system. There may be some important or maybe not important, but at least existing religious differences.
I think Dr. Lubna is back with us. Dr. Lubna, your second question, please. Can she hear us?
Oh, yes, thank you. I have a quick comment here, not a question. If you just look at the Bhutan has a different family organization. In Bhutan, they have a strong preference for girl child. Why? Because they think that when they marry off the girl, the boy will come to their home to take care of the parents of the girl. So because of that, they feel proud if they have more girls. So their family structure operate in exactly the opposite we have in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And one more thing, that it is not only the social security in case of South Asian countries which compel the parents to have a son, but in our cases, especially in tribal areas, females themselves want to have a son as their child because they think that it would determine their bargaining position within the family. So the more sons they will produce, they will have the higher power in the family structure. So that is another reason that we have the son preference here, other than the social security purposes.
Thank you. I want to make clear that the second paper did look at expectations of old age support as a factor, and that is part of it. But it's that I don't mean to say that that is the entire reason son preference exists. It's part of this broader family of a patrilineal family system, as I started talking about in the beginning, with the role that sons play, which is old age support, but goes far beyond that in the system, right? Versus what daughters do, right? And the reason women, for example, gain status when they have that son is they've achieved, right, what they're supposed to do, which is make sons to continue the family, right? So, but it's part of the broader patrilineal family system and culture. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Kira, do you think social media can play a significant role in terms of sort of neutralizing this excess demand for boys in the family in regions like Pakistan?
I mean, I think it's possible. I think there has been some normative change. I don't know as much about Pakistan, but I assume that I'm more aware of India and Nepal, and there has been some normative change there. I think there's been less, but still some normative change in Pakistan. I do expect that some of that is due to this global change. The entire development machinery, if you will, is really promoting this message that girls are good and that you should treat your daughters well. I think that's having some effect. Maybe not huge, but it's not nothing. I think that is playing a role, and that these changing attitudes and beliefs are out there and I would say that they would be complementary for these more demographic pressure that I'm discussing. That you might be even more, okay, I ended up with 2 daughters. That's not really what I wanted. I wanted a son, but I'm also hearing these messages that that's okay, and so maybe I'm quicker to adapt and be okay with that, rather than say go on to have the 3rd birth to try for a son. So I could see those things being mutually complementary and reinforcing. Yeah. All
right, I think we are running short of time. So thank you, Dr. Kira. It is a very interesting topic, and I think it opens rooms for further research, also opens avenues for further research.